Y&R Spoilers reveal that Kyle keeps telling himself that he is gradually becoming a new force in the cosmetics industry, but everything he does only further exposes his immaturity, lack of depth and the rashness hidden in every decision. He always believes that with his youth, acumen and the relationships he had at Abbott, he will soon build his own reputation, filling the void left by the past. However, Kyle's every step is a discordant note in the symphony of competition, betrayal and ambitions intertwined in the harsh business world. In the short time since leaving the protective arms of his family, Kyle longs for recognition, to be seen by others as a new icon, a man who can stand on his own 2 feet without the support of anyone. But he mistakenly thought that he was smart enough to control the game when he entered into a relationship with Audra. This was not only a strategic mistake, but also a trigger for a series of long-lasting troubles. The danger lies not in Audra being simply a business rival, but in her ability to read Kyle's every weakness, turning his smallest mistake into an opportunity to break his remaining will and confidence. Claire, who was once considered Kyle's spiritual support amid the storms, is the one who can see through all his schemes, intrigues, and even his deepest insecurities. With a rare calmness, Claire constantly warns, hoping to preserve Kyle's sanity, even though she knows that all advice is like a drop in the ocean in front of his competitive nature and oversized ego. Claire's presence in Kyle's life is like a mirror reflecting all his dark corners and flaws, and she is the one who has to witness him push himself to the depths that she cannot save. In recent days, the atmosphere between Kyle and Claire has become thick and heavy, a mixture of disappointment, helplessness, and even silent anger. Claire always appears with cold eyes, a closed face, every frown or forced smile exudes an undisguised disgust for Kyle's way of life and choices. Every breakfast, every time they meet, there are no more intimate moments of sharing, but instead there is a cold distance, as if the two are living in 2 completely separate worlds that only coincidentally intersect at some faint point. Kyle doesn't realize that change, or deliberately ignores it because his pride is hurt. He still maintains the same triumphant tone every time he talks about Audra, about the plan to trap her in the vortex of her own ambitions and calculations. But the deeper Kyle dives into that dangerous game, the more he exposes the cracks in his soul: insecurity, lack of confidence, and fear of being left behind. Audra, with her sharp intuition, easily realizes that Kyle is just a young man struggling to escape the shadow of his family and temporary success. As time goes on, Kyle becomes more and more confused in the love triangle he has created for himself. Between heavy breakfasts with Claire and inviting evenings with Audra, Kyle is faced with a crossroads of choice: continue to sink deeper into the spiral of deception and hypocrisy, or stop to keep the peace that is gradually cracking in his soul. The climax is when Claire unexpectedly catches Kyle texting Audra to meet for a drink, a seemingly harmless act but like a bucket of cold water poured straight into the last trust Claire has for Kyle. At that moment, Claire's face shows everything: unbearable disappointment, disgust at Kyle's true self and pity for a man who is losing himself because of short-term power games. She no longer argued, no longer patiently explained or reminded. The silence stretched on, covering the room, creating an invisible barrier that the more Kyle tried to break, the more he realized his own helplessness. Deep down, Claire knew that she was no longer Kyle's priority. The dinners that used to be rare times for them to talk and share were now just a faint memory, giving way to quick dates, clever lies, and cold indifference that stung. Kyle seemed to not realize that constantly putting Audra above Claire was like destroying the fragile bond that remained between them. With each passing day, Kyle sank deeper into his obsession with Audra. Not only because she was a formidable opponent, but also because he was allowing himself to become a pawn in Audra's game without even knowing it. The plans to trap Audra turned out to be a psychological trap he created for himself, leading to many consequences that Kyle did not foresee. When everything gradually got out of control, when Claire's eyes were no longer a guiding light but only coldness and strangeness, Kyle suddenly realized that he had lost too many precious things just because of ambition and blind pride. In late May, the atmosphere between the 3 of them became more and more tense and oppressive. Every small movement could trigger an emotional explosion at any time. Kyle seemed to no longer be himself, increasingly moving away from the values that had helped him stand firm when he left Abbott. That change was not only a failure in his career but also a bitter failure in spirit and emotion, when he lost the woman who truly cared for and wanted to protect him. The event of Kyle choosing to have a drink with Audra instead of having dinner with Claire, which seemed small, was the last straw, erasing all hope for a reconciliation between him and Claire. From Claire's disappointed eyes, from the faint smile on Audra's lips when accepting the temporary victory, Kyle suddenly realized that sometimes the most precious thing is not the frivolous fame out there, but the person who is by his side in his weakest moments. However, all the regret at this time only made Kyle more lonely. Claire quietly withdrew, leaving behind a huge void that could not be filled by any business achievements. Audra, even if she could win the game of power, could never replace the position that Claire once held in Kyle's heart. Kyle's uncertainty and confusion between two women, one representing a peaceful past, the other symbolizing an uncertain future, brought him to a painful but necessary crossroads of maturity. And then, when all the masks fell off, when his calculations and self-deceptions had no place to hide, Kyle was forced to face the naked truth. Rebellion, ego, and fear of being forgotten could never compensate for the loss of love, of trust, of a true home in his soul. This event is not only the end of a relationship, but also the beginning of a difficult journey of self-discovery and redemption for Kyle, a man who once thought he was strong enough to overcome everything, but was weakest when facing himself. Audra's appearance in the cosmetics market has created an unpredictable undercurrent, arousing not only fear but also challenge in the hearts of her competitors. For Audra, every game in the market is a test, an opportunity to assert her abilities and rise to the position she believes she deserves. When she proposed an advertising war between her new company and Jabot, this not only created tension within Jabot but also became a test for Kyle. An ambitious heir who was always struggling between the family's shadow and the desire to assert himself. Kyle did not rush to agree, but Audra's proposal made him think. At a time when Jabot was struggling with personnel changes, development strategies were constantly challenged and customer trust was gradually becoming a variable, Kyle realized this was an opportunity to prove himself. However, alongside the competitive spirit is a constant doubt. Is this an elaborate trap set by Audra to drag him into an endless cycle of endless battles? As a young manager, Kyle does not allow himself to act rashly. He spends a lot of time pondering Audra's proposal, considering each scenario, each consequence that a hasty decision can cause for Jabot and himself. But the more he analyzes, the more he realizes that this game is not simply a matter of revenue or market share. It is also a contest of honor, power, and the ability to control the situation. For Kyle, this is a golden opportunity to assert his position, but also a challenge that can make him lose everything if he does not know when to stop. Beside Kyle is Claire, who is always cautious, thoughtful, and more than that, the only one who dares to look straight at all the potential risks that others often easily ignore. When Kyle mentioned Audra's proposal, Claire's eyes immediately lit up with caution. She understood Audra's nature and motives, knowing that behind her charming and confident appearance was a sharp mind, always knowing how to use every relationship, every little piece of information to serve her own personal purposes. Claire repeatedly reminded Kyle of the dangers of underestimating Audra, especially when Kyle's own pride and desire to win could become a fatal weakness. Claire and Kyle began to work together to outline a countermeasure. As each day passed, the pressure from the board of directors and the creative team made the atmosphere at Jabot increasingly tense. The advertising war, although not yet officially started, spread to every corner of the office, every meeting, every glance. Kyle, who loved confrontation, constantly discussed with Claire ideas to not only respond to Audra, but also turn the passive into the active, even turn the tables if possible. The exchanges between the two increased, but underneath was a simmering conflict. Kyle did not always agree with Claire's rational warnings and suggestions. His pride and ego gradually turned into a wall, making Kyle feel that Claire was sometimes too cautious and lacking in innovation. On the contrary, Claire was torn between two choices. Continuing to support Kyle even though she knew he could go astray, or strongly preventing him to keep both of them from being drawn into the dangerous game that Audra had set up. Audra, meanwhile, was not impatient. She patiently observed, step by step bringing Kyle under her control without using any seductive tricks. Her sharpness lay in the ability to turn the other person into a bad guy in the eyes of others without having to lift a finger herself. For Audra, the image of a Kyle so infatuated with power and ambition that he ignored moral boundaries or emotional values was the result she wanted. She understood that if Kyle destroyed his ideal boyfriend image with his own hands, everything else was just a matter of time. Claire and Kyle's plan became more and more complicated. At first, they wanted to turn the advertising war into a peak performance for Jabot, turning danger into opportunity, promoting their image and attracting public attention. They researched every new trend, took advantage of social media, used young faces, and created campaigns that spread widely in the community. But the deeper they went, the more overwhelmed Kyle became with the huge workload, and the pressure from the expectations of leaders and employees gradually made him lose his initial sobriety. Claire, noticing the unstable signals from Kyle, became increasingly worried. She clearly saw the change in him: sleepless nights, unreasonable anger, harsh words, and even a distant, lost look in his eyes. She tried to listen, to be supportive, but every effort seemed to only make Kyle more frustrated, feeling controlled rather than supported. Conflict escalated, turning brainstorming sessions into heated arguments followed by long, cold silences. The advertising war officially broke out. Audra launched extremely sharp media campaigns, aimed directly at Jabot's traditional weaknesses: conservatism, lack of creativity and dependence on old faces. Immediately, Kyle and Claire faced pressure from the public, the press, shareholders, and other competitors. Under that pressure, the rift between Kyle and Claire grew wider. Trust was gradually eroded by suspicion and mutual blame. Audra realized that and continued to be patient. Instead of trying to seduce Kyle, she simply let things happen naturally, knowing for sure that Kyle would stumble because of his lack of emotional control, hasty decisions, and his unconscious putting power and ambition above love. Without any drama, Kyle gradually showed himself to be a bad boyfriend, neglectful, distant, willing to sacrifice love in exchange for a temporary victory in the market. Claire, despite her heartache, still tried to hold on. But the more she held on, the more she felt helpless and lost in front of Kyle, who was sliding towards darkness. With each passing day, the image of Kyle in Claire's eyes faded, giving way to a strange man, selfish, arrogant, always putting success above all else. Everything seemed to have spiraled out of control, and even though she wanted to save it, Claire realized that there were things that could not be returned to the way they were. By the time the results of the advertising war were decided, Kyle seemed to have completely lost himself. Although Jabot might not have lost, or even won in some aspects, the price he had to pay was too great. The relationship with Claire was almost broken. The trust, respect, and even the beautiful feelings that once existed were now just echoes in memory. Audra, although she may not have achieved all her business goals, has succeeded in proving that sometimes, just letting her opponents fall into their own traps, without having to take action, is enough to make them lose what is most precious. Kyle, when he realized everything, could only remain silent before the emptiness in his soul. He understood that the game of power is sometimes just a disguise for irreparable losses, and no victory is big enough to fill the void of a broken love. And Claire, in the end, was forced to learn to let go, leaving behind the torment and regret of a guy who was once very sweet, but because of ambition and pride, he destroyed all the most beautiful things with his own hands. The story between Audra, Kyle, and Claire is a testament to the complexity and multidimensionality of the world of the young and the restless, where the line between success and failure, between love and calculation, between keeping and losing, is always as fragile as smoke. Just one wrong decision, just one time of putting ambition above feelings, everything that was once precious can disappear without a trace, leaving behind only valuable lessons about people's hearts, about choices, and the price to pay for temporary glory. After so many excuses, denials, and evasions, the truth was finally revealed under the harsh light of reality. The photos of Kyle and Audra, thought to be just harmless moments between two friends, became undeniable evidence of the shady relationship, of the deep cracks in the heart of the man who was once respected at Jabot and in the small family he once cherished. No longer vague rumors, each cold frame imprinted with that handshake, that look, that intimate gesture exposed Kyle's true nature, a man who no longer had the courage to look straight at what he had done to Claire, to his career, and to his own honor. The news spread quickly within the company, like a fierce wind sweeping through every room, every gaze. For Victoria, who had hoped that Kyle would be a breath of fresh air that could bring vitality, change and breakthrough to the group, it was a wound that could not be erased. Victoria's disappointment came not only from Kyle's destruction of her own image, but also from his betrayal of trust, putting personal ambitions and desires above all common values. In the large but cold office, Victoria sat in deep thought for a long time, sometimes just shaking her head slightly, the bitter feeling clearly visible on her face. The times she had protected and backed Kyle in front of the board of directors, shareholders, and even potential competitors had now become meaningless when all her efforts only showed her mistake in putting her trust in the wrong place. On the other hand, Claire faced the bad news not with rage, nor with the screams of reproach as people often imagine a betrayed wife. On the contrary, Claire's calmness was the sharpest weapon, exposing all the weakness and cowardice in Kyle's heart. The day the first photos appeared on social networks, on internal emails, and even in anonymous messages sent to her personal phone, Claire just quietly observed, read every comment, and listened to every gossip. Her eyes no longer had the gentle gaze of the first months of love, but instead were exhausted trust, the hurt accumulated in suffocating silence. Claire had repeatedly reminded Kyle of the boundaries between work and personal relationships, and had tried to patch up and heal the invisible cracks with the tolerance and patience of a woman who once truly believed in her husband's maturity. But in the end, all sacrifices became meaningless when the person being loved did not know how to preserve and cherish the most basic values of the family. In Claire's mind, every memory of Kyle, who had been her rock, her companion, her devoted husband, was shattered into pieces that could not be put back together. As the phone rang with endless messages, Claire slowly opened each image. Each image was a knife that cut deep into her self-esteem. Not only because of the intimacy between Kyle and Audra, but also because of the feeling of being betrayed by the only person she had ever trusted completely. Any explanation or defense from Kyle became redundant and empty before the truth was clearly exposed and undeniable. The questions, worries, and disappointments that had been on the rise for so long finally had answers. That was when Claire understood that all efforts to save, all efforts to preserve happiness had come to an end. Kyle, on the other hand, faced a storm of criticism, suspicion, and even silent humiliation from colleagues, friends and family with a confused and suffocating state of mind. He had believed that as long as he kept things under control, as long as he cleverly hid his mistakes, everything would return to normal. But every attempt to justify himself only made him seem smaller and more insignificant in the eyes of others. Avoiding Victoria's questions, not daring to look Claire in the eye, Kyle became lost in the very place that used to be his playground. The eyes of those who once trusted him were now full of suspicion and contempt. From being the pride of the Abbott family, a rising star in the cosmetics business, Kyle now became an example of decadence, selfishness, and failure of a man who could not control himself in the face of temptation. Victoria's coldness when facing Kyle was the end of all hope of returning to his old position. There were no more words of encouragement, no more nods of agreement for new projects. Instead there were indifferent eyes, decisive decisions, and even internal inspection instructions to review all of Kyle's activities up to now. For Victoria, the reputation and stability of the corporation were above all. She would not allow any individual, no matter how meritorious, to destroy the values that had been built with the sweat and tears of many generations. Victoria's cold decision was not only a warning to Kyle, but also a wake-up call for anyone who intended to put personal interests above the collective. In the midst of it all, Claire began to quietly prepare for her own final liberation. The decision to divorce did not come from a moment of impulsiveness, nor was it a petty act of revenge, but was the final choice of a woman who had reached the end of her patience. She no longer had the strength to tolerate, forgive, or try to explain the repeated mistakes. In Claire's soul now was a cold calm, a determination to put aside all remorse and doubt to begin a new journey. A journey to find herself after years of losing her value because of trying to hold on to someone who was not worthy.